Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Sunday, April 12th, 2026, and today's the fifth and final installment of the mini-series on what happens when we die. And today I'm addressing specifically what happens to our consciousness, or even our soul, when we die. And thus far, I've approached the issue as to what happens mainly from a scientific, and some would even say physicalist perspective. That is, we exist at every moment in a specific set of coordinates in the space-time continuum. Like right now, with the release of this vlog, if you're watching at 6 a.m. on April 12th, then we are together in some senses as living sentient beings connected somewhere on the planet. If you're watching or you're listening to this vlog a little bit later in the day or the next day or next year, or what have you, I might no longer be here, at least again in that physical sense. But I've argued that beyond our physical existence, consciousness and awareness of some kind live on, at least as information that exists, that has been inscribed in our space-time coordinates, and some of which we've shared together. Okay, but what happens after our bodies have actually expired, fallen apart, and the organic shell that once housed ourselves no longer exists? What really happens to consciousness? Okay, well, here's my answer. And in short, there are two real and realistic possibilities, in my view, both of which are awesome. First, a brief definition of consciousness. So in humans, simply put, consciousness is our awareness of our thoughts and memories, our feelings, sensations, and our surroundings, our environments. If our brains and central nervous systems are functioning properly, we usually have a reasonably certain sense of our own selves, of our own beingness or existence. So from a psychological perspective then, consciousness is essentially your awareness of yourself and your surroundings. Not surprisingly then, a great many people would like to know what happens then exactly to consciousness when we die. And many fear that what might happen is that they might lose that sense of self. And that's perhaps terrifying for some people. Or they're afraid that they die and then that's it. That's what I often hear. And so it might be that in some senses they really want to live forever in some way or another. So I get that. But again, here's the good news. I said a moment ago there are two realistic possibilities as to what happens to our consciousness when we die. And they're both awesome. So first, and the one perhaps you might hope most will be the case. First would be that our consciousness lives on at some level in space-time forever, as I've already suggested. The physicalist portion of that answer is that after the coherent organic self no longer exists, the diffuse array of mass and energy are then recycled in countless ways and continue to manifest in the universe. The philosophical argument that favors the proposition that consciousness lives on, if you will, comes in part from Thomas Clark's essay, Death, Nothingness, and Subjectivity. And the argument is based on the all too common belief that if death is the end, then the dying individual will be cast into a kind of oblivion or nothingness at death. It's a kind of positive nothingness into which the individual ends up being plunged. But in Clark's view, there's an error in such thinking that involves, especially among the secularists and the scientists, the tendency to, quote, reify nothing, to make it a positive condition or quality, for example, of blackness, and then place the individual in it after death, so that we somehow fall into nothingness to remain there eternally, end quote. And so Clark argues we have to dispense of this fallacy. Instead, he favors a kind of immortal consciousness. That is, as conscious beings, we experience life then as an uninterrupted sequence of experiences, at least beyond the moments of sleep, which I'll come back to. And we sense that we have a self that exists for however many years we live between birth and death. And so Clark argues that conscious awareness then persists no matter what, because we cannot stop being aware at some level, or rather, that is from the perspective of consciousness itself. It never ceases to exist. So why would we expect consciousness to stop existing even in death? We can't experience nothingness, and in that sense, it doesn't exist to our conscious selves. We construct it, of course, but it doesn't really exist, not to the conscious self. And so the simplest way to understand this is, again, to simply think about what happens when we go to bed at night. We're awake and conscious one moment, and then what happens? We go to sleep and we're unconscious for whatever number of hours, okay? And as we sleep, I mean, apart from the dreams and so on, we're just not aware of anything that's happening, right? Many times I've woken up in the morning and I have no recollection of anything that happened. It's just like the computer had shut down and then it gets rebooted in the morning. So my point here is that, are we afraid that somehow we don't exist when we're asleep? No, not usually, right? Setting aside, again, the dreams and possibly nightmares that we sometimes have, and at least for myself, I know there's so many times when I'm asleep and I'm unconscious, and then I just simply wake up. And as far as myself is concerned, then I just took a bit of a break, and voila, I'm back, right? So, and that's what we are in the universe. We are awake and aware in this form. And then we do stuff, obviously, while we're awake. Then we take a break, or we go to sleep. And what happens is our subjectivity, our subjective self, just simply jumps the gap from our past experience and what we were doing and who we were before, say, we went to sleep, until we wake up again. And then, again, here we are. And so all the stuff that happens when we're asleep is, at a fundamental level, sort of irrelevant to us as the subject, the conscious being, when we're awake. Again, especially if we can't remember any dreams or anything that happened while we were asleep. Okay? And then the continuum of consciousness then transcends just our own personal experience. As the well-known neuroscientist Sam Harris puts it, quote, "The birth of any conscious being after your death is in some sense deeply analogous to your own rebirth. Given your identity as consciousness, your survival of death is more or less assured as long as consciousness persists anywhere." End quote. So in other words, in the most profound sense then, we really do continue on as consciousness itself. But let's take it a step further into religion. Most people the world over actually further believe that we have a soul, described or explained in different ways, depending upon the religion and the culture and so on. Do you believe, with more than half the world, that there's a kind of non-material consciousness, that it persists and continues even after we die? And that is, in that some kind of a form, our soul continues on. So simply put, there's a strong preference for some kind of immortality, and that in death we nevertheless experience an enduring sense of having existed as conscious human beings. And that soul would be the continuation and expression of what would persist after the physical self has, again, departed. And for many people, the soul in that form is even judged by God, say, based on what we've done or failed to do in our lives. No problem, in my view, because basically as the conscious beings that we are, we can and have then developed all kinds of different moral accounting systems that allow us to track our behavior on earth and what we're supposed to do while we're conscious. At the very least, hopefully, these beliefs help motivate people to develop a conscience to complement their consciousness. You follow? And even if you don't have a well-developed sense from formal religious teachings, I take the default position that nearly every reasonably normal conscious being tries to operate with principles that kind of align with the light in ourselves. Yes, life can be hard, and we can be programmed or socialized to do really horrible stuff from time to time. But I see that in terms of the default position of the infant. And indeed, for nearly every small child, the default position is one of leaning into goodness and the light. So I think most people then, across cultures, strive to be good people, to do the right thing, to be moral, at least to varying degrees, and, with all of our flaws, etc. And if you believe in a soul too, then presumably you'd be even more driven or inspired to aspire to being a loving, a kind, a helpful, generous, and decent human being. Again, at least within the accepted parameters of your society. Many view the human condition as one forever caught in this kind of cosmic struggle between good and evil, between virtue and sin. Even though we know we're supposed to try to do good things while we're here. And let's face it, most of us feel pretty darn good, even great about ourselves when we do good things. And that is to say, when we help others, when we demonstrate our goodwill, when we solve problems. Again, everything from the smallest of gestures to the greatest of sacrifices. And if you're religious, then that's generally reinforced with ideas about what happens to your soul when you die. That is, we're accountable for our actions, not only then in this life, but also in the afterlife and what happens to the soul. That's what many people believe. So if you truly believe in that concept, and if that is in fact what actually happens, just for argument's sake, then why should we fear death or non-existence in the least? Well, for many Christians and Muslims and practitioners of other spiritual traditions that emphasize some kind of eternal soul, I think that such believers wouldn't have any fear of death whatsoever, right? In fact, they'd welcome death and the rise of the soul out of their bodies for eternal life. The depictions of that eternal life, by the way, in general, are way better than what we experience in this particular life, right? So to me, it's kind of a no-brainer. If our souls can and do live on forever, get it? The no-brainer concept. If they live forever with God or in heaven or in some other way, then to me, that's truly amazing, a miracle. Fantastic, okay? But then this brings me to the other option. What if there's no continued consciousness, say, in the form of a soul after death? What if that's the objective reality in some senses? So, the point would be here, setting aside what I've already suggested in terms of consciousness living on in other forms, or the permanence of our existence in space-time. What if there's no soul, then, in the biblical sense, or no heaven like I was taught in Sunday school? Well, it's still cool and potentially awesome, but then it depends more on what we've done and how we've lived our lives while we're here. So what have you done with yourself while you're awake and during all those countless moments of consciousness? What habits and patterns do or did you form to do loving and kind and helpful and compassionate stuff from moment to moment? Conversely, to what extent did you fill your moments with negativity, fear, anger, cruelty, or spend your time hurting others and creating misery and suffering in their lives? The simple fact is that if you spent as much time as possible cultivating the loving kindness and the goodness in yourself, then that'll be the dominant pattern and the narrative of your life. You'll ideally have shown your light as brightly as you can and as often as you could. And that's really an amazing contribution that each of us can make in our lives, no matter what happens. And the more you've been able to shine your light in this life, the more you'll get to experience that light in whatever form it manifests for eternity. Or as the Beatles once sang, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. Well, if you've only been dark or hurtful or cruel in your thoughts and intentions and then your actions, well, then that'll be your legacy. Is that what you really want? Most of us know. It's actually incredible to me that so many people who are out there who do are either one or two things. Either A, they claim to be religious, and yet they continue to live with such darkness in their souls and foist that darkness upon the rest of the world, despite the negative, eternal consequences that they themselves believe will befall them. Or, conversely, it's also equally, unfathomable to me how many people who don't believe anything comes next, right? And yet they still choose to spend their lives inflicting pain and misery on others, for they'll have ruined then the only period of time that they actually believe exists. So whether you're talking about the miserable politicians or some religious extremists out there who are damaged to their core and driven by such hatred, or just some random neighbor down the street or person you don't know who seems to, regularly act like a total a-hole, if you will. It's truly a shame, in my view, that that's their worldview, okay, and that's how they operate. And again, not to pick necessarily on people like Trump or Putin or Netanyahu, but I've seen all these characters. You've probably seen them too. Do they really smile that often, or even, that is to say, in loving ways or with loving kindness in their hearts, either in public or, gosh, in private, for all I know? I don't see it. Do they enjoy life? Do they enjoy helping others and seeing, other people's thrive, etc.? Honestly, for all their wealth and power, those folks that I mentioned and so many others seem like just miserable human beings. And they create so much more misery for others. And again, so do a few people that I encounter every now and then in everyday life too. It's a shame. So simply put then, no matter what your belief about consciousness and even the soul, in my view, there's no philosophical, religious, or really any compelling reason to live life other than where we each strive to shine our lights as brightly as possible while we're here. It's the only logical conclusion I can draw, no matter what the consequences. So whether, we're either contributing in positive ways to universal consciousness or to eternal life in accordance with our religious beliefs, or we're sharing the light within ourselves and making the world a more amazing place while we're here, if you think that that's all we have. So now, in my view, no matter what position you take, then you have something to look forward to at the end of this life. And the more love and kindness and positive energy that you spread in this life can only benefit yourself and humanity, no matter what ultimately happens to your consciousness and to your soul. And never forget that either possibility that I've outlined here can and will be awesome, at least if you have a life that you've lived well and done your best. All right, until next we meet, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, dole out hugs in abundance. Peace.